I'm hoping to have Chip Tatum on and let him talk about this model. And it's an interesting guy, and he has a lot to say about the Clintons. You know, he's the pilot that delivered cocaine to them. Just every time I hear her voice, you know, I'm imagining her husband Bill getting that briefcase of cocaine, you know. I don't know. I mean, just, it's disturbing of how much they bent the law. Maybe they haven't broken the law in some areas, but they definitely bent it. But if you have a leader that's not afraid to take a stand, I don't know. It's a catch-22, isn't it? And what do you guys think of it so far? I do come from a political family. So, but Chip is different. Chip is different. He puts himself out there. You know, I thought about taking the PACE exam to get into the CIA at one point. Considered it. Because it was intriguing to me. And, you know, that's kind of a cool thing. You know, I was in my early 20s and going through college. And I didn't finish college, so that wasn't really an option. But I was interested. I don't know if anybody else has, but. So what do you think of the debate so far? Anybody? Yes, that's true, Apocalypse. I mean, I knew about that. There was between Little Rock, Arkansas, and what's that called? Oh, I can see the name. Starts with an F. Fuckity fuck. Crap, I just cursed. Gosh, I've driven to this place so many times. Well, that sounded just bad. Well, anyway, two cities connected by one highway, Little Rock, and I'll think of the name of the city in a minute. But, there. I'm reading the chat. Well, I don't see anyone really talking about the debate. So let's go on to part 3. I want to stay on focus. Let me get rid of part 2. Let me get rid of that one too. And we're going to go to part 3. It's about 12 minutes. And we'll discuss. Try to remember what points you want to talk about and write them in the chat if you so wish. But do you see my dilemma on the Democratic debates? I just, it's embarrassing. I mean, I thought the Republican debates were more embarrassing, especially with Trump. And, you know, I know he would be I can't.
I'm going to ask you a question, and you can add whatever you'd like to, but let me ask you, is the world too dangerous a place for a governor who has no foreign policy experience?
John, the world is a very dangerous place, but the world is not too dangerous of a place for the United States of America, provided we act according to our principles, provided we act intelligently. I mean, let's talk about this arc of instability that Secretary Clinton talked about. Libya is now a mess. Syria is a mess. Iraq is a mess. Afghanistan is a mess. As Americans, we have shown ourselves to have the greatest military on the face of the planet. But we are not so very good at anticipating threats and appreciating just how difficult it is to build up stable democracies, to make the investments in sustainable development that we must as a nation if we are to attack the root causes of these sorts of instability. And I wanted to add one other thing, John, and I think it's important for all of us on this stage. I was in Burlington, Iowa. And a mom of a service member of ours who served 2 duties in Iraq said, Governor O'Malley, please, when you're with your other candidates and colleagues on stage, please don't use the term boots on the ground. Please don't use the term boots on the ground. My son is not a pair of boots on the ground. These are American soldiers. And we fail them when we fail to take into account what happens the day after a dictator falls, and when we fail to act with a whole-of-government approach with sustainable development, diplomacy, and our economic power in alignment with our principles.
Well, I think it's perfectly fair to say that we invested quite a bit in development aid. Some of the bravest people that I had the privilege of working with as Secretary of State were our development professionals who went, sometimes alone, sometimes with our military, into very dangerous places in Iraq, in Afghanistan, elsewhere. So there does need to be a whole-of-government approach. But just because we're involved and we have a strategy doesn't mean we're going to be able to dictate the outcome. These are often very long-term kinds of investments that have to be made.
When you talk about the long-term consequences of war, let's talk about the men and women who came home from war. The 500,000 who came home with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And I would hope that in the midst of all of this discussion, this country makes certain that we do not turn our backs on the men and women who put their lives on the line to defend us, and that we stand with them as they have stood with us.
Secretary Clinton, you mentioned radical jihadists.
Yes.
Marco Rubio, also running for president, said that this attack showed, and the attack in Paris showed, that we are at war with radical Islam. Do you agree with that characterization, radical Islam?
I don't think we're at war with Islam. I don't think we're at war with all Muslims. I think we're at war with jihadists who have...
Just to interrupt, he didn't say all Muslims. He just said radical Islam. Is that a phrase you don't...
I think that you can talk about Islamists who clearly are also jihadists, but I think it's not particularly helpful to make the case that Senator Sanders was just making, that I agree with, that we've got to reach out to Muslim countries, we've got to have them be part of our coalition. If they hear people running for president who basically shortcut it to say we are somehow against Islam. That was one of the real contributions, despite all the other problems, that George W. Bush made after 9/11, when he basically said, after going to a mosque in Washington, we are not at war with Islam or Muslims. We are at war with violent extremism. We are at war with people who use their religion for purposes of power and oppression. And yes, we are at war with those people, but I don't want us to be painting with too broad a brush.
The reason I ask is that you gave a speech at Georgetown University in which you said that it was important to show, quote, respect even for one's enemies, trying to understand and, insofar as psychologically possible, empathize with their perspective and point of view. Can you explain what that means in the context of this kind of barbarism?
I think with this kind of barbarism and nihilism, it's very hard to understand, other than the lust for power, the rejection of modernity, the total disregard for human rights, freedom, or any other value that we know and respect. Historically, it is important to try to understand your adversary in order to figure out how they are thinking, what they will be doing, how they will react. I plead that it's very difficult when you deal with ISIS and organizations like that whose behavior is so barbaric and so vicious that it doesn't seem to have any purpose other than lust for killing and power, and that's very difficult to put ourselves in the other shoes.
Just very quickly, do either of you, radical Islam, do either of you use that phrase?
I don't think the term is what's important. What is important to understand is we have organizations, whether it is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who do believe we should go back several thousand years. We should make women third-class citizens, that we should allow children to be sexually assaulted, that they are a danger to modern society, and that this world, with American leadership, can and must come together to destroy them. We can do that.
John.
And it requires an entire world to come together, including, in a very active way, the Muslim nations.
Governor O'Malley, you've been making the case when you talk about lack of forward vision. You're essentially saying that Secretary Clinton lacks that vision, and this critique matches up with this discussion of language. The critique is that the softness of language betrays a softness of approach. So if this language, if you don't call it by what it is, how can your approach be effective to the cause? That's the critique.
I believe calling it what it is to say radical jihadis. That's to call what it is. But John, let's not fall into the trap of thinking that all of our Muslim American neighbors in this country are somehow our enemies here. They are our first line of defense. And we are going to be able to defeat ISIS on the ground there as well as in this world, because of the Muslim Americans in our country and throughout the world who understand that this brutal and barbaric group is perverting the name of a great world religion. And now, like never before, we need our Muslim American neighbors to stand up and to be a part of this.
Secretary Clinton, the French president has called this attack an act of war.
Yes.
A couple of days ago, you were asked if you would declare war on ISIS, and you said no. What would you say now?
Well, we have an authorization to use military force against terrorists. We passed it after 9/11.
And you think that covers all of this?
It certainly does cover it. I would like to see it updated.
If you were in the Senate, would you be okay with the Commander-in-Chief doing that without coming back to you?
No, it would have to go through the Congress. And I know the White House has actually been working with members of Congress. Maybe now we can get it moving again so that we can upgrade it so that it does include all the tools and everything in our arsenal that we can use to try to work with our allies and our friends, come up with better intelligence. You know, it is difficult finding intelligence that is actionable in a lot of these places, but we have to keep trying. And we have to do more to prevent the flood of foreign fighters who have gone to Syria, especially the ones with Western passports, to come back. So there's a lot of work we need to do, and I want to be sure that what's called the AUMF has the authority that is needed going forward.
Senator, let me just, let's add that to whatever you've got to say. Refugees. You've been a little vague on what you would do about the Syrian refugees. What's your view on them now?
Let me do that, but let me pick up an issue, a very important issue that we have not yet discussed. This nation is the most powerful military in the world. We're spending over $600 billion a year on the military. And yet significantly less than 10% of that money is used to be fighting international terrorism. We are spending hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining 5,000 nuclear weapons. I think we need major reform in the military, making it more cost effective, but also focusing on the real crisis that faces us. The Cold War is over, and our focus has got to be on intelligence, increased manpower, fighting international terrorism. In terms of refugees, I believe that the United States has the moral responsibility with Europe, with Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, to make sure that when people leave countries like Afghanistan and Syria with nothing more than the clothing on their back, that of course we reach out. Now, what the magic number is, I don't know, because we don't know the extent of the problem. But I certainly think that the United States should take its full responsibility in helping those.
Governor O'Malley, you have a magic number. I think it's 65,000. Does that number go up or down based on what happened yesterday?
John, I was the first person on this stage to say that we should accept the 65,000 Syrian refugees that were fleeing the sort of murder of ISIL. And I believe that needs to be done with proper screening. But accommodating 65,000 refugees in our country today, people of 320 million, is akin to making room for 6.5 more people in a baseball stadium with 32,000. There are other ways to lead and to be a moral leader in this world rather than at the opposite end of a drone strike. But I would want to agree with something that Senator Sanders says. The nature of warfare has changed. This is not a conflict where we send in the 3rd Divisions of Marines. This is a new era of conflict where traditional ways of huge standing armies are not as serve our purposes as well as special ops, better intelligence, and being more proactive.
Just very quickly, 65,000, the number stays.
That's what I understand is the request from the international.
But for you, what do you want?
I would want us to take our place among the nations of the world to alleviate this sort of death and the specter we saw of little kids' bodies washing up on a beach.
Secretary Clinton, let me ask you a question from Twitter, which has come in. And this is a question on this issue of refugees. The question is, with the U.S. preparing to absorb Syrian refugees, how do you propose we screen those coming in to keep our citizens safe?
I think that is the number one requirement. I also said that we should take increased numbers of refugees. The administration originally said 10. I said we should go to 65, but only if we have as careful a screening and vetting process as we can imagine, whatever resources it takes, because I do not want us to in any way inadvertently allow people who wish us harm to come into our country. But I want to say a quick word about what Senator Sanders and Governor O'Malley said. we do have to take a hard look at the defense budget, and we do have to figure out how we get ready to fight the adversaries of the future, not the past. But we have to also be very clear that we do have some continuing challenges. We've got challenges in the South China Sea because of what China is doing in building